You feel too much. You care too deeply. And somewhere along the way, you learned that your own needs were inconvenient. Carl Jung's final revelation about empaths will completely shatter what you think you know about compassion. Here's the truth he uncovered. The empath is simply the child who was never permitted to be selfish. That crushing need to fix everyone around you, that instinct to absorb their suffering like a sponge, that automatic reflex to erase yourself so others can breathe easier, that's not a spiritual gift you were born with. That's survival code written into your nervous system during a childhood where your needs were labeled too much, your feelings dismissed as too loud, and your very right to exist was conditional, dependent on how well you served everyone else. But here's where Jung's insight becomes revolutionary, almost radical in its compassion. He didn't see empaths as damaged goods. He saw them as travelers halfway through the hero's journey, what he called individuation, the sacred path toward becoming whole. And you already know this, don't you? Deep in your bones, you've always sensed that your empathy came with a price tag you could never quite read. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But here's your secret wound. You've always felt that who you truly are was never given permission to exist, that your authentic self was sacrificed at the altar of other people's comfort. By the end of this journey together, you'll finally understand why your sensitivity feels like both a sacred gift and an unbearable burden. You'll recognize the psychological patterns that hijacked your natural empathy and weaponized it into a survival strategy. And most crucially, you'll discover Jung's path to what I call sacred selfishness, the healthy boundaries that alchemize empathy from compulsion into conscious choice. This isn't about becoming cold or indifferent. This is about reclaiming your birthright, the permission to care for yourself with the same fierce intensity you've always poured into caring for others. Jung understood something that most people completely miss about how empaths are made. What we celebrate as empathy in adults often begins as what I call emotional hypervigilance in childhood, a survival mechanism that develops when a child's physical or emotional safety hinges on constantly monitoring the faster, emotional weather systems of their caregivers. Picture this pattern, and tell me if it feels familiar. The child who learns to decode their parents' moods before the parent even opens their mouth. The little one who becomes the family's emotional early warning system, always detecting storms on the horizon before anyone else notices the clouds gathering. The kid who discovers that their own needs create friction and tension, but anticipating others' needs creates safety, approval, love. Jung called this premature ego adaptation when children develop sophisticated psychological skills not through healthy organic development, but through sheer necessity. Your nervous system became a seismograph calibrated to detect danger, attuned to every emotional tremor rippling through your environment. This wasn't conscious learning. This was adaptive rewiring. Your brain literally restructured itself to survive in an emotionally volatile, unpredictable landscape. You developed what Jung termed psychological antenna, an almost supernatural ability to sense what others feel, what they need, sometimes before they know it themselves. But here's what Jung discovered that changes absolutely everything. This survival adaptation came at a devastating cost. The suppression of what he called your authentic selfishness, the healthy narcissism that every child needs to develop a robust sense of self. Jung wrote, "The healthy individual is able to love himself as much as he loves others. But you, the future empath, learn the opposite lesson. Love others more than yourself, because your needs are dangerous." If you learned to read the room before you could read books, drop a comment. I was the family emotional detective. This creates what I call the empathic paradox. The very sensitivity that makes you exquisitely attuned to others becomes the wall that prevents you from knowing yourself. You became a world-class expert in everyone else's inner landscape, while remaining a complete stranger to your own. Jung understood that while this pattern kept you alive as a child, it becomes quietly self-destructive in adulthood. The child who was never allowed to be selfish grows into the adult who can't advocate for themselves, can't set boundaries without drowning in guilt, can't even identify their own needs half the time. Jung made a startling, almost subversive discovery about what lies buried in the unconscious of people with empathic patterns. In the shadow, those rejected, exiled parts of your psyche, he found not darkness, but what I call forbidden selfishness, the natural self-advocacy and self-preservation instincts that were labeled unacceptable, even dangerous, in your childhood. Most empaths carry crushing guilt about their shadow because it contains everything they were taught made them bad. Anger, boundaries, the word no, putting themselves first, having needs, demanding respect, taking up space. Jung called this shadow formation through moral conditioning. But here's Jung's revolutionary, almost heretical insight. These so-called selfish impulses aren't pathological. They're not character defects. They're the missing pieces of a complete personality. The empath who never learned healthy selfishness becomes what Jung termed a wounded healer, someone who gives from emptiness rather than abundance, from depletion rather than overflow. Jung observes something profound. Empaths often unconsciously resent their own compassion. They give and give and give. But underneath the kindness, there's rage simmering. There's bone-deep exhaustion. There's a part of them that wants to stop caring, to walk away, to choose themselves for once without apology. This doesn't mean you're secretly a terrible person. It means Jung's compensation principle is at work. Your psyche is desperately trying to balance one-sided development by forcing the rejected qualities into your awareness. Think about what Jung called enantiodromia, the tendency for things to transform into their opposite when pushed to extremes. The person who gives endlessly eventually becomes bitter. The one who never says no eventually explodes in resentment. The empath who refuses to integrate their shadow becomes cynical, hardened. Jung understood that shadow integration isn't about becoming selfish. It's about reclaiming your right to exist as a complete, three-dimensional human being. The empath's shadow contains their sacred selfishness, the healthy ego, strength that actually enables authentic, reciprocal relationships. If you've ever felt crushing guilt for wanting to put yourself first, comment, "My needs feel selfish, but they're not wrong." Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." For empaths, the darkness isn't cruelty or narcissism. It's the simple, radical act of believing you matter just as much as everyone else. Jung identified a specific psychological crisis that empaths face, a turning point. He called the individuation imperative, the moment when your psyche demands that you become who you actually are, not who you learn to be, for survival. This crisis often manifests as what I call empathic burnout, not just tiredness, but a profound soul exhaustion that comes from living inauthentically for years, maybe decades. Jung understood this as the psyche's rebellion against continued self-abandonment. The symptoms Jung documented are unmistakable. You can't fake caring anymore. The old motivations feel hollow. People's problems feel crushing instead of meaningful. You start resenting the very quality that once defined your identity, your willingness to help others, to be there, to sacrifice. Jung saw this not as failure or weakness, but as psychological emergence, your authentic self, fighting to be born. But its birth requires dismantling the false self that was constructed around serving, pleasing, fixing. This is where Jung's concept of the transcendent function becomes crucial. The transcendent function is your psyche's innate ability to bridge opposites, to hold paradox. In this case, the caring self and the self-caring self. It's not about choosing between empathy and selfishness. It's about integrating both into what Jung called individuated wholeness. Jung observed that empaths in this crisis often feel like they're betraying everyone by changing. People say things like, "You're not the same person anymore. You've become selfish. What happened to you?" Jung understood this as the collective's resistance to individual development, people reacting to your growth because it threatens the role you played in their lives. But here's what Jung discovered about this process. The people who truly love you will support your transformation. The ones who resist it, who guilt trip you, who punish you for changing, they were benefiting from your self-abandonment. Jung called this differentiation anxiety, the fear that healthy boundaries will end relationships, and sometimes they will. But Jung would ask, were those real relationships or were they transactions? Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But for empaths, this requires what I call developmental courage, the willingness to disappoint people who preferred you diminished, who needed you small. If you've been told you've changed since setting boundaries, comment, "I didn't change, I just stopped hiding." Jung understood that this individuation crisis is actually a spiritual emergency, the soul's non-negotiable demand for authenticity. The empath who heeds this call doesn't become less caring. They become consciously caring instead of compulsively caring. Jung introduced a concept that most people fundamentally misunderstand: sacred selfishness. This isn't narcissistic self-absorption or toxic individualism. It's what Jung called the ethical obligation to become yourself, the recognition that your first responsibility is to your own psychological and spiritual development. Jung wrote, "Your vision becomes clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes." For empaths, looking inside often reveals years, sometimes decades, of self-neglect cleverly disguised as virtue. What I call conscious selfishness involves several key elements that Jung identified as non-negotiable for psychological health. First, emotional sovereignty. The recognition that you are not responsible for managing other people's feelings. Jung understood that taking responsibility for others' emotions actually prevents their psychological growth. You're not helping them, you're enabling their stagnation. Second, boundary consciousness. The ability to sense where you end and others begin. Jung called this ego boundary development, and he saw it as essential for both individual health and authentic relationship. Without boundaries, there's no real intimacy, just enmeshment. Third, need legitimacy. Accepting that your needs are as valid, as urgent, as worthy as anyone else's. Jung observed that empaths treat their own needs as optional suggestions, while treating others' needs as commandments carved in stone. Here's what Jung discovered that might surprise you. Empaths who develop sacred selfishness actually become more helpful, not less. They give from choice rather than compulsion, from fullness rather than emptiness, from strength rather than weakness. This creates what Jung called differentiated love, the capacity to care for others without losing yourself in the process. You can feel compassion without absorbing their pain like a sponge. You can offer support without taking responsibility for their healing. You can love without disappearing. Jung understood that the highest form of service comes from individuals who have done their own inner work. The person who has reclaimed their sacred selfishness offers the world their authentic presence rather than their people-pleasing performance. If you've discovered that caring for yourself makes you a better helper to others, comment, "I give from overflow, not emptiness." Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." For empaths, this includes accepting the parts of themselves that want recognition, rest, reciprocity, and respect, all the things you were taught were selfish to desire. Jung made a profound observation about what happens to an empath's relationships when they begin practicing sacred selfishness. He called it relational recalibration, the process where relationships either deepen through mutual authenticity or end because they were built on the empath's self-abandonment. Empaths who begin setting boundaries often discover something shocking, even painful. Many of their relationships were built on what Jung called projective identification. People weren't relating to them as individuals. They were relating to them as functions: the caretaker, the listener, the problem solver, the emotional support animal. Jung observed that when empaths stop playing these functional roles, some people experience what I call supply withdrawal. They become angry, manipulative, accusatory, even cruel. because their emotional needs are no longer being automatically met without reciprocity. But Jung also documented something beautiful. The relationships that survive this transformation become what he called authentic encounters. Instead of one person perpetually giving and one perpetually receiving, both individuals meet as equals, each taking responsibility for their own emotional well-being. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But true meeting, true intimacy, can only happen between individuated people, those who know where they end and others begin." This is why Jung emphasized that empaths must learn what I call relational selectivity. Not everyone deserves access to your empathy. Not every person who asks for help is actually ready to receive it. Not every relationship that feels familiar is healthy. Sometimes familiar just means repeating childhood patterns. Jung understood that empaths often confuse intensity with intimacy, neediness with love, and drama with depth. Learning to recognize the difference requires developing what Jung called psychological discernment, the ability to see people as they actually are, rather than as you wish, hope, or need them to be. The individuated empath attracts fundamentally different people than the self-abandoning empath. They draw those who are also doing their own inner work, rather than those hunting for someone to do it for them. Jung observed that this shift can feel profoundly lonely at first, because you're breaking generational patterns of codependency. But it ultimately leads to what he called authentic belonging relationships based on mutual respect rather than mutual need. If you've noticed that setting boundaries changed who wants to be around you, comment, "I attracted my equals when I stopped accepting less." Jung's wisdom here is crystal clear. You cannot have authentic relationships until you become an authentic person. And becoming authentic requires embracing your sacred selfishness. Jung's vision of psychological wholeness includes what I call the integrated empath, someone who has reclaimed their sensitivity as a conscious choice rather than an unconscious compulsion. This person represents Jung's ideal, individuation achieved. The integrated empath possesses what Jung called conscious empathy, the ability to feel with others without losing themselves in the process. They've learned to use their sensitivity as a tool rather than being used by it. Jung identified several characteristics of this integration. First, emotional choice, the capacity to decide when and how much to feel with others. Jung understood that healthy empathy has an on-off switch controlled by conscious will, not automatic response. You choose when to tune in, when to tune out. Second, compassionate detachment, the ability to care without carrying. Jung observed that the most genuinely helpful people maintain what he called loving distance, close enough to help, far enough away to maintain perspective and protect their own well-being. Third, reciprocal relationships, connections where empathy flows both directions, like a figure eight. Jung noted that integrated empaths naturally attract people who can also give, creating what he called mutual individuation, both people growing through the relationship. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." The integrated empath has achieved this by learning that their truest self includes both their capacity for profound compassion and their non-negotiable right to self-preservation. This integration creates what Jung called earned security, a deep inner stability that doesn't depend on others' approval, emotional state, or validation. The integrated empath can witness others' pain without absorbing it like poison. They can offer support without taking responsibility for outcomes. They can love without losing themselves. Jung understood that this level of integration actually serves the collective good. Integrated empaths model healthy boundaries, authentic relationships, and conscious compassion. They show others that it's possible to be sensitive without being self-destructive. The journey from unconscious empathy to conscious empathy is what Jung called the hero's journey of the psyche. It requires facing the shadow, integrating the opposites, and choosing wholeness over approval. If you've learned to help others without hurting yourself, comment, "I'm a conscious empath now." Jung's final insight about empaths is this: your sensitivity is indeed a gift, but only when it's offered from a place of choice rather than compulsion, strength rather than weakness, wholeness rather than woundedness. The empath is just the child who was never allowed to be selfish. But now you understand what Jung really meant. Your empathy isn't your flaw. It's your unfinished development. You learn to weaponize your sensitivity as a survival tool instead of cultivating it as a conscious choice. You're not too much for this world. You're just finally becoming enough for yourself. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.